Hi guys, here is a lecture about chapters 7 and 8 from Texts and Contexts. So chapter 7 covers psychological criticism, and psychological criticism is basically the application of an idea or a theory or a piece of an idea or theory from psychology to a literary text, with the intention of helping you um, analyze or interpret that literary text. So any idea or theory will work if you are taking a psychology class right now, for instance, and you stumble across an idea in that class that you think would be applicable to one of the texts we're reading in the class. That's great. The class kind of welcomes that, or I welcome that. Typically, though, ideas from Freudian psychology and ideas from Carl Jung tend to be used in psychological criticism, although really any idea from psychology can be used. So then this idea or theory gets applied to either the writer of a literary text, we try to psychoanalyze the writer, the speaker or narrator of a literary text, speaker if it's a poem, narrator if it's a story, or a character in a literary text. I mean, it can be tricky to try to psychoanalyze a fictional character, but sometimes people try to do it. Be careful not to make too many assumptions about a writer's supposed quote-unquote craziness based on his or her work. I mean, be careful about the things you say and really take into account the extent to which writers fictionalize things or try to deliberately create a character who maybe is unstable, for instance, in the case of Edgar Allan Poe. Sorry, I'm a little sick here. Try not to cough and hack too much. I know it's a little gross to listen to. Psychological criticism doesn't require that you have extensive knowledge of psychology or expertise in the discipline of psychology. If you're not sure which ideas are good to use for psychological criticism, you can always just use the questions that come after the pieces of literature in the chapter about psychological criticism and use those as a guide. So here's an example of how psychological criticism can work. There's this poem on page 214 by Emily Dickinson called A Narrow Fellow in the Grass. And if you consider the questions that follow this poem, you might start wondering, who is this narrow fellow that the writer, the speaker, is talking about? How does the speaker's attitude toward him change and develop throughout the poem? It seems like Dickinson's writing about a snake, but also could she be communicating some kind of subconscious fear, wish, or desire here, perhaps about something sexual? A lot of readers read this into the poem. If you read the questions that follow this poem, you'll see that I'm not just being some kind of a pervert here. A lot of readers kind of read it in this way. So Freud believed, as many psychologists, most psychologists, and many of the general public believe now, that our mind has these two parts. So a conscious one that we can have access to at any time, and a subconscious one that we don't really have access to, but it still affects our feelings and behaviors. So it's possible for somebody to subconsciously want something or fear something or desire something and communicate that without even realize they're doing it. And so we can read the poem in this way, that Dickinson fears something or desires something that the snake represents, and maybe she's not consciously communicating that she fears or desires this thing that the snake represents, but she's doing it subconsciously. So, chapter 8 comprises two different types of criticism, feminist criticism and queer theory criticism. And so feminist criticism basically examines the way in which sex and gender are portrayed in a literary text, and not only what that tells us about culture, but also what that tells us about gender stereotypes. So are those stereotypes kind of undermined in the text, or are they challenged? What does the text tell us about gender and power is maybe the ultimate question that a feminist critic would ask. And feminist criticism doesn't require a person to be ideologically feminist. Really, all it requires a person, although certainly you can be, all it requires a person to do is to consider kind of the relationship between gender and power in a literary text and how those things are portrayed. So queer theory is kind of like philosophy, but it's about a specific topic. And so the topic it's about is like sexuality in society and how sexuality is considered by a society, I guess, and who has power based on sexuality, what power relationships look like. And so what sometimes queer theory criticism can look like is examining sexuality in a literary text and the way it's portrayed. So is it portrayed heteronormatively? Is it portrayed homophobically? Is it portrayed like in what way? So who has power and why based on sexuality? Also, is sexuality portrayed in kind of a traditional way? Is it portrayed in a progressive way? And how does that intersect with gender? So, examples of feminist query? I just combined two different words I was looking at on the screen there, queer and theory. Sorry. An example of feminist criticism and queer theory, I need to get more sleep and drink a little more coffee maybe, is there's this poem on page 245. It's a sonnet, actually, by Shakespeare called Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And if you read that, you might start thinking, hey, it sounds like Shakespeare, or the speaker, I guess, the speaker is addressing a woman. So he begins by saying, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more beautiful and more temperate. Rough winds may shake the darling buds of May, something, something. I'd have to look at it to remember, but something about your eternal summer shall not fade. So it sounds like he's writing to this person who's feminine and beautiful, and she's never going to age, and he's trying to or she will age, but he's trying to immortalize her in this poem because she's in this perfect phase of life where she's like a summer's day. She's beautiful and not too harsh, and there are all these things about her that are great. But what you might not realize is that this poem is actually one of the young man sonnets which Shakespeare dedicated to this mysterious Mr. W.H. Some people think that Mr. W.H. means William himself, so he was writing it to himself as a young man. But a lot of other people, most critics, think that this was actually addressed to a young man who Shakespeare knew. Maybe somebody who acted in his plays and was dressing up like a woman, and we don't really know, but there are some candidates out there if you read the criticism of the young man sonnets for this mysterious figure in Shakespeare's life. And so this is one of the poems that he dedicated to a young man. And so a thing to consider from the perspective of feminist criticism and queer theory is how does our interpretation of the poem change if we know that, or does it change? So why is it interesting that we think why do we assume that this poem is written to a woman or addressed to a woman? Why couldn't it be written or addressed to a man? Why do we assume the gender of the person that he's speaking to? And if we know that he's writing to a young man or speaking to a young man, does it matter? And if it matters, how? And also, what kinds of things he's talking about, he's comparing this addressee to a summer's day in all of these interesting ways. And what about those ways seems feminine to us and why? So does this tell us anything about how we conceive of femininity as opposed to how we conceive of masculinity? All of these questions are questions that a feminist critic or a queer theory critic might ask of